Chief Bannister threw the folder across the table and laughed until the whole room went cold. You, sniper school? In my program? He pointed one thick finger straight at Captain Claire Whitmore's chest. I've broken men twice your size. Men who wanted it more than you ever will. You'll quit by Friday, sweetheart. And when you do, I'll be the one holding the door open for you. The other candidates snickered. Nobody said a word in her defense. Claire didn't flinch. She just picked up the folder, straightened it, and looked him dead in the eye. Before we go any further, if you believe respect should be earned and never handed out, take 1 second right now and subscribe to this channel. Stay with me all the way to the end of this story because what happens to Claire is going to stay with you long after it's over. And do me one small favor. Leave a comment and tell me the city where you're watching from right now so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. Fort Pierce, Florida. The heat was already thick at 5 in the morning, and the room where the candidates gathered smelled like sweat and burnt coffee and something else. Something Claire recognized from a lifetime of walking into places she wasn't supposed to be. It was the smell of men waiting for a woman to fail. Chief Bannister was not a large man, but he filled a room the way a storm fills a valley. 22 years in, a chest full of experience nobody in that room could match, and a reputation that arrived in a place before he ever did. He had trained some of the finest marksmen the country had ever produced. He had also, by his own proud admission, sent more candidates home crying than any instructor in the program's history. He wore that like a medal. Whitmore, he said again, rolling her name around in his mouth like he was tasting something spoiled. Captain Claire Whitmore, 38 years old. He looked up from the folder he had thrown and then picked back up. You know what the average age is in this room, Captain? I don't, Chief, she said. Her voice was steady, not loud, not soft, just level. 26, Bannister said. 26! These boys are in the best shape of their lives, and you walked in here at 38 thinking you were going to hold a rifle steady after a 12-mile ruck and put rounds on target and win that changes its mind every 10 seconds. He shook his head slowly. Somebody upstairs owed somebody a favor. That's the only way I can figure it, because there is no way on God's green earth that you belong in my program on merit. A young candidate near the front, tall and broad through the shoulders, laughed out loud. His name was Ryan Cole, and Claire would come to know that laugh very well. She'll be gone by the water phase, Cole said, not even bothering to lower his voice. $10 says she cries. I'll take that bet, another candidate answered. 20 says she doesn't make it to the water phase. The room laughed harder. Bannister let them laugh. He wanted them to laugh. That was the thing Claire understood in that first minute that none of the young men understood. The cruelty was not an accident. It was a tool. Bannister used mockery the way other men used a whip to see who would break under it before the training ever started. Claire had been broken before, not by men like Bannister, by life, by loss, by long Montana winters and empty chairs at the dinner table. And she had learned something in all of that which no 26-year-old in the room had learned yet. Words only hurt you if you're still trying to be liked. She wasn't there to be liked. Is there a question in there, Chief? She asked. Or should I get information? The laughter stopped. Not all at once. It sort of died in pieces, the way a fire dies when you stop feeding it. Bannister's jaw tightened, just slightly, just enough that Claire caught it. He had expected her to shrink. He had built a whole morning around watching her shrink, and she had refused him the one thing he wanted. Get information, Captain, and he said. His voice had lost its playfulness. And let's see how long that mouth lasts when your legs give out. She got information. What none of them knew, what Bannister himself would not learn for weeks, was that Claire Whitmore had held a rifle before most of these boys could walk. She had learned to read wind before she learned to read a clock. And the man who taught her, the man whose voice still lived somewhere in the back of her skull, was a name Chief Bannister spoke with something close to worship, though he had no idea he was standing in the same room as that man's blood. But that came later. First came the pain. The first day was designed to eliminate. Everyone knew it. The instructors didn't hide it. Bannister stood in front of them at first light and told them exactly what the day would do to them. Half of you will be gone by tonight, and he said. I don't say that to scare you. I say it because it's true, and because the ones who stay need to know what it costs. This is not a place for people who want to feel special. This is a place for people who can put a bullet where it needs to go when everything in their body is screaming at them to stop. That's it. That's the whole job. Everything we do today is to find out who quits. Then he looked directly at Claire, or who gets carried out. They ran. They rucked. They carried weight that dug into the collarbone and turned the shoulders into fire. Claire was not the fastest. She had never been the fastest. There were young men in that formation who could have run her into the dirt on a track, and everyone could see it, and Cole made sure to say it. "Keep up, Captain," he called back to her, grinning, barely breathing hard. "Or do we need to slow the whole class down for you?" Claire didn't answer. She had learned, on the ranch, that you don't waste breath on words when you need that breath to keep moving. She kept moving. And here was the thing that started, very quietly, to get under Cole's skin. She never fell out. She never dropped. She was never first, but she was never, ever last. And she never once asked anyone to wait. The miles piled up. The sun climbed. Candidates began to fall. A young man from Ohio went down at mile 9 and did not get up, and the instructors carried him to the side, and just like that, the formation was one man smaller. Another quit at the halfway mark, simply stopped, hands on his knees, shaking his head. Done. Bannister didn't yell at him. He just wrote something on his clipboard and moved on. That was somehow worse than yelling. By the time they staggered back, there were fewer of them than there had been that morning. Claire was still there, sweat-soaked, legs trembling, but there. Cole was there too, and he was furious, though he would not have been able to tell you why. He had expected to watch her break. He had wanted to watch her break. And instead, he had spent the whole morning aware of her presence behind him, steady, refusing to disappear. "You're going to get somebody hurt," he told her that night in the barracks, low so the instructors wouldn't hear. "You know that? Out on the range, when it's your turn and you can't hack it, somebody's going to have to cover for you. You're taking a slot from a guy who actually earned it." Claire was cleaning her boots. She didn't look up. "Which guy?" she asked. "What? Which guy did I take the slot from?" she said, still not looking up. "Point him out. I'd like to know who I'm supposedly cheating." Cole opened his mouth, closed it. He didn't have a name, and they both knew it. He had an anger without a shape, the kind of anger men carry when they were told their whole lives that a place belonged to them, and then a woman walked into it and refused to apologize for being there. "You'll see," he finally said. "You'll see when it counts." "I hope so," Claire said, and now she did look up, and there was no anger in her face at all, which somehow bothered him more than anger would have. "Because that's the only part I care about, Cole. The part where it counts." She went back to her boots. Cole walked away with the strange, hollow feeling that he had lost an argument he was sure he'd been winning. The days that followed were built to hollow a person out. Land navigation came next, and land navigation was where the young ones fell apart. They were given coordinates and a compass in a stretch of unforgiving country, and they were told to find their way through it, and most of them did what young, strong, confident people always do. They rushed. They trusted their legs to fix what their patience had broken. They plunged into terrain that all looked the same to them, and they got turned around, and they burned hours going the wrong direction, and some of them never made it to the checkpoints at all. Claire moved differently. She slowed down when everyone else sped up. She stopped, more than once, and simply stood still, reading the shape of the land the way her grandfather had taught her to read it. Not the way it looked, but the way it behaved, where water would run, where the ground would rise. What the country was trying to tell her if she would only shut up long enough to listen. Shut up. An instructor named Torres watched her from a distance that day, and he wrote something on his clipboard, and he did not laugh. Claire hit every checkpoint. Not fast, she was never fast. But she never got lost, not once, not for a single minute. And when the day ended, she was one of only a handful of candidates who had cleared the entire course clean. Cole cleared it too, barely, coming in soaked and scratched, and cursing under his breath. He saw her sitting calmly at the end, not even winded, and something in him twisted. "Beginner's luck," he muttered. 20 years on a ranch isn't luck," Claire said quietly, almost to herself. Cole heard it, and for the first time, he didn't have anything to say back. That was the crack. That was the first small crack in the wall of certainty the young men had built around her. She was supposed to be a punchline. Punchlines don't clear the land nav course clean while the strong young men wander lost. Punchlines don't outlast half the formation on the first ruck. Slowly, without anyone announcing it, the candidates began to watch her not to see her fail, but to see how she kept not failing. Everyone except Bannister. Bannister only doubled down. He rode her harder than anyone. Every drill, every formation, every inspection, he found her. He questioned her strength out loud. He questioned her age out loud. He questioned, in front of the whole class, whether she had the stomach for what the deed actually asked of a person. "You ever taken a life, Captain?" he asked her once, standing far too close, his voice pitched to carry. "You ever had to do the real thing? Because holding steady on a paper target is a child's game. Holding steady when it's real, when there's weight to it, that's a different animal. And I don't think you've got it in you. I think you're going to freeze. And when you freeze, people die." The room went very still. Claire looked at him for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was so quiet that the men had to lean in to hear it. "You don't know what I've got in me, Chief," she said, "and I'm not going to spend my energy trying to convince you. You'll find out when the targets tell you. They don't lie, and they don't care about your opinion. Neither do I." It was the closest thing to defiance she had shown, and it landed like a slap. Bannister's face darkened. He was a man who had spent 2 decades making candidates flinch, and here was this 38-year-old woman refusing over and over to give him the flinch he needed. "We'll see," he said. "Yes, Chief," Claire answered. "We will." That night, one of the younger candidates, a quiet kid named Pruitt who had said almost nothing to anyone, sat down across from Claire in the mess and asked her the question that had been eating at half the class. "Where'd you learn to move like that?" he asked. "On the nav course, and the way you never rush. The instructors talk about it when they think we can't hear." Claire considered him for a moment. He was young, maybe 23, with the kind of open face that hadn't yet learned to hide anything. "My grandfather raised me on a ranch in Montana," she said. "After my folks passed, there was a predator coming down out of the high country, taking our livestock. Grown men, real hunters, tried to track it for weeks and couldn't. I was 14. Pruitt leaned in. "What happened?" "I sat still," Claire said. "For most of a day. I read the wind. I waited. And when the moment came, I took one shot, and it was the right one." She turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "My grandfather never called it luck. I remember that. Everybody in the county called it luck, a 14-year-old girl making that shot. He never did. You know what he called it?" "What?" "Discipline," Claire said. "He told me anyone can pull a trigger, but only patient people understand when to pull it. I was 14 and I didn't really know what he meant. I've spent the rest of my life figuring it out." Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who was your grandfather?" And Claire smiled just a little and said, "A better shot than anyone in this program will ever be, including the man who runs it." She didn't say the name. Not then. But something in the way she said it made Pruitt sit up straight, because there was a legend in that program, a name Bannister invoked constantly, a name he treated like scripture. Every time Bannister wanted to shame a candidate, he held up this one legendary marksman as the standard nobody could reach. And Pruitt, looking at Claire's face, had the sudden strange feeling that he was one question away from something enormous. But before he could ask it, the mess doors banged open and Bannister walked in, and the whole room stiffened, and the moment passed. The crucible of that first stretch of training was the stalking phase. And the stalking phase was where legends were made or destroyed. The idea was simple and brutal. A candidate had to cross open ground in view of trained observers with optics and get close enough to a target to take a shot without ever being seen. It sounded impossible to the young men. Most of them treated it like a physical challenge, a thing to be attacked with strength and speed. They crawled fast, they got impatient. They moved when they should have stayed still, and the observers picked them off one by one, calling out their positions like they were shooting fish in a barrel. Cole failed his first attempt in under 4 minutes. He came back to the line red-faced and silent, and for once he didn't have a joke. Then it was Claire's turn. She took her time getting into position, and Cole, watching from the line, made a small, dismissive sound, certain she would be spotted even faster than he had been. Bannister stood with the observers, arms crossed, a small, cruel smile on his face, waiting. An hour passed. The observers scanned the ground. They saw nothing. Cole stopped smirking. Another hour passed. The sun moved. The observers grew tense, sweeping the field again and again, murmuring to each other. And still nothing. Bannister uncrossed his arms. "Where is she?" one of the observers said quietly. "She's out there," Torres answered. "She hasn't scored yet. She's still moving." "That's not possible," Cole muttered. "It's been 2 hours. Nobody moves that slow. Nobody has the patience." But Claire did. Because to Claire, this was not a training exercise. This was Tuesday afternoon on a Montana ridge with a predator somewhere below her, and nothing but her own stillness between her and failure. She moved in inches. She moved in the space between one breath and the next. She became, exactly as her grandfather had taught her, part of the ground itself, and the ground does not draw the eye. When the shot finally came, it came from a position so close that the observers physically startled. Bannister's head snapped around, and there, far closer than any candidate had ever managed to get, closer than Bannister himself would have believed possible, was Claire Whitmore, exactly where she was not supposed to be able to be. The observers were silent. Cole was silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Torres walked out to her position, and when he got close, he crouched down and looked at her with something Claire had not seen from an instructor since she arrived. It was not amusement. It was not doubt. It was respect, plain and unguarded. "Where?" Torres said. "Did you learn to disappear like that?" Claire wiped the dirt from her face and looked up at him. "My grandfather taught me how to disappear," she said, "before the military ever taught me how to fight." Torres held her gaze for a long second. Then he stood, and he turned back toward the line, and he called out the result loud enough for everyone to hear, loud enough for Bannister to hear, loud enough for Cole to hear. "Closest approach in the phase," Torres said, "by a wide margin." The line erupted in a low murmur. Candidates who had failed the same exercise in minutes stared out at the woman they had spent weeks writing off. And Cole, standing at the edge of it all, felt the ground shift under everything he thought he knew. Bannister said nothing, but that evening, alone in the instructor's office, he pulled Claire's file back out, and this time he did not throw it. He read it. He read it slowly from the beginning, looking for the favor he was so sure someone had called in to put her here, and he did not find it. What he found instead was a record that made his stomach tighten. Marksmanship scores from years back that he could barely believe. A history that started, of all places, on a family ranch in Montana. And a name in the emergency contact section, an old name, a family name, that made Chief Bannister sit back very slowly in his chair. Because it was a name he knew. It was the name of the legend, the marksman he had held up as scripture for 20 years. The man whose standard he swore no candidate could ever reach. Bannister read the name 3 times. Then he set the folder down, and for a long moment he simply sat there in the dark, a hard man face to face with the possibility that the woman he had mocked in front of the whole class was not a favor and not a mistake and not a punchline, but the grandchild and the student of the greatest shooter he had ever revered. He did not say a word about it. Not that night, not for a long time. He was not a man who could apologize easily, or at all. But something changed in him in that dark office. Some certainty cracked, and he knew the way you know a storm is coming before you can see it, that this woman was going to force him to eat every word he had thrown at her. The next morning, Bannister stood in front of the formation as he always did. But when his eyes found Claire, they lingered differently. He did not mock her. He did not call her out. He simply looked at her a beat too long, and Claire, who missed nothing, caught it. She didn't know yet what he had found in that file, but she knew the look of a man who had just discovered he was standing on ground that was not as solid as he believed. "Today," Bannister announced, and his voice was rougher than usual, "we shoot. Real distance, real wind. This is the part that separates the ones who look good in the classroom from the ones who can actually do the job." He paused. "Some of you have been coasting on your legs in your youth. That ends today. Out here, your legs don't mean anything. Your youth doesn't mean anything. Out here, it's just you, the rifle, and the truth." Cole shifted uncomfortably. He was one of the ones who had been coasting on his legs in his youth, and he knew it. Whitmore, Bannister said. The whole formation tensed, expecting the usual, expecting the mockery. Yes, Chief, Claire answered. Bannister looked at her, and for a moment it seemed like he might say something true, something honest, something that had been building in him since that dark office the night before. But he was Bannister, and 22 years of pride do not undo themselves in a single morning. You'll shoot last, he said, after everyone else. We'll see if all that crawling around in the dirt means anything when there's a target at distance and everyone's watching. Yes, Chief, Claire said. But Cole, standing beside her, heard something the others missed. He heard that Bannister had not called her sweetheart. He had not called her too old. He had not made a single joke. And Cole, who had spent weeks taking his cues from the chief on exactly how much to disrespect this woman, suddenly realized that his commanding officer had stopped disrespecting her, and he did not know when it had happened, and he did not know why. That night, Cole couldn't sleep. He lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about the stalking phase. 2 hours. 2 hours of a stillness he could not have managed for 2 minutes. He thought about the land nav course, where he had wandered lost while she walked through it like she'd built it. He thought about the first ruck and how he had waited all morning for her to fall out, and how she never did. And he thought about the things she'd said, so quietly he almost missed it. 20 years on a ranch isn't luck. Cole was 26 years old, and he had spent his whole life being told he was exceptional, and he was beginning to understand, alone in the dark, that being told you are exceptional and actually being exceptional are two very different things. The woman 3 bunks over had never once told anyone she was exceptional. She had simply refused to fail over and over, quietly, while everyone waited for her to break. He didn't apologize to her. He wasn't ready for that yet, but he stopped that night, telling himself she didn't belong. Because the evidence had piled up too high, and there was no story left he could tell himself that made the evidence disappear. Across the barracks, Claire lay awake too, though for different reasons. She was thinking about her grandfather. She was thinking about that first shot at 14 and the word he had given her that day. Discipline. She was thinking about how far she had come from that Montana ridge, and how, no matter how far she went, she carried that ridge inside her everywhere. In the stillness she could find when everyone else panicked, in the patience that had already carried her past men half her age. And she was thinking about tomorrow, and the distance, and the wind, and the fact that she would shoot last, with the whole formation watching, with Bannister watching, with a target set at a range that had already broken stronger arms than hers. She was not afraid. That was the thing that would have surprised every man in that formation, if they could have seen inside her. She was not afraid at all, because targets don't care who you are. They only care whether you can hit them. And Claire Whitmore had spent her entire life learning exactly how to hit them. She closed her eyes. Somewhere in the dark, Bannister sat awake in his office with a file he could not stop reading and a truth he was not ready to speak. Somewhere in the dark, Cole stared at a ceiling and rebuilt everything he thought he knew about who deserved to be here. And Claire, calm as the still ground she knew how to become, let herself remember one more time the sound of her grandfather's voice on a cold Montana morning, telling a scared 14-year-old girl that anyone could pull a trigger. But only patient people ever understood when. Tomorrow they would find out what patience was worth. Tomorrow the targets would speak, and when they did, there would be nothing left for anyone in that formation to argue about, because the truth about Claire Whitmore was about to arrive in a language that no laughter, no doubt, and no cruelty could ever talk its way out of. The morning of the distance shoot arrived gray and restless, and the wind was already wrong. Every shooter in that formation could feel it. The wind was not steady, not honest, not the kind of wind you could learn once and trust for the rest of the day. It came in gusts, then died, then came back from a slightly different direction, like it was toying with them. Bannister stood at the front of the line with his hands behind his back and a look on his face that Cole could not read anymore. And that in itself made Cole nervous, because for weeks Cole had been able to read the chief perfectly. Conditions are bad, Bannister said. Good. He let that sit for a moment. You think a target's going to wait for a nice day? You think the wind's going to do you a favor when it matters? He shook his head slowly. The job doesn't care what you deserve. The job doesn't care how hard you trained. The job asks one question, and it asks it in the worst possible conditions at the worst possible time. Can you make the shot? That's it. That's all there ever is. He turned and looked down the line, and his eyes passed over the young men, over Cole, over Pruitt, and settled for just a second on Claire. We'll find out today, he said, who's been telling themselves a story and who's been telling the truth. They started shooting. The first candidate up was a kid named Delgado, strong, confident, the kind of young man who'd been the best shot in every room he'd ever walked into until he walked into this one. He settled behind the rifle, and everyone watched, and the wind gusted just as he pressed the trigger, and his rounds sailed wide. He adjusted, fired again, wide the other way. By his fifth shot, the frustration was written all over his back, in the tightness of his shoulders, in the way he jerked at the rifle instead of working with it. Bannister watched without a word and made a note, and Delgado stood up knowing he had failed and knowing everyone had seen it. Wind beat him, Pruitt murmured, standing beside Claire. No, Claire said quietly. His nerves beat him. The wind just held the door open. Pruitt looked at her. She was watching the flags, the grass, the way the dust lifted and settled across the range. She wasn't even looking at Delgado anymore. She was reading the air. One after another they went, and one after another the range chewed them up. A candidate from Georgia missed badly and cursed loud enough to earn a sharp word from Torres. Another rushed his shots trying to beat the wind instead of waiting it out, and paid for it. The failures piled up, and with every failure the mood on the line grew heavier, because these were the strong ones, the young ones, the ones who'd laughed at a 38-year-old woman weeks ago, and the range was humbling them one by one. Then it was Cole's turn. Cole had been the loudest voice against her from the beginning. $10 says she cries. He'll take that bet. He carried that memory with him now as he settled behind the rifle, and for the first time it didn't feel like a joke. It felt like a debt he hadn't paid yet. He set up well. Cole was genuinely talented, and everyone knew it. And for a few shots, it looked like he might be the one to break the range's streak. His first 2 rounds struck close. His third caught the target's edge. And then the wind shifted on him, that dishonest, shifting wind. And Cole did the thing that talented young men do when they've never really been tested. He trusted his talent instead of his patience. He didn't wait. He sent the round while the wind was still moving, and it drifted, and he missed. And then he chased the miss and missed again. And by the end, he was 2 rounds short of the standard. He stood up slowly. He didn't curse. He didn't make excuses. He just stared downrange at the target that had beaten him, and something in his face had changed. He walked back to the line and took his place beside Claire, and he didn't look at her, and she didn't say anything, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have made it worse. But Bannister said something. "Cole," the chief called out. "You had it. First 3 rounds, you had it. You know why you lost it?" Cole's jaw tightened. "The win, Chief." "No," Bannister's voice was flat. "You lost it because you got greedy. You saw the target and you wanted it too bad, and you took the shot before the shot was ready. You let your want get ahead of your discipline." He paused. "That's a young man's mistake, and out there it gets people killed." Cole said nothing, but the word discipline landed on him strangely, because he had heard it before, weeks ago in the mess hall, in a quiet voice from the woman standing right next to him. 20 years on a ranch isn't luck. He remembered now that she'd never once made a young man's mistake. Not on the ruck, not on the nav course, not in the stalking pits. She had never let her want get ahead of anything. More candidates went. More failed. A few scraped by, barely meeting the standard, relieved just to have survived. The pile of the fallen grew, and the tension on the line stretched tighter and tighter, because everyone in that formation understood what was coming. Claire was shooting last. Bannister had ordered it, and now the whole exercise had become, without anyone saying so, about her. The young men who had bet against her weeks ago were no longer betting. They had watched her clear the nav course clean. They had watched her ghost through the stalking phase for 2 impossible hours. And now they stood in the gray wind and watched the range destroy their strongest shooters, and they turned one by one to look at the woman who was still waiting her turn with a calm that none of them could manufacture. Pruitt leaned over to her. You nervous? He asked. He asked it like he genuinely wanted to know, like her answer might teach him something. Claire was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My grandfather told me something the day I made my first shot that mattered. I was 14. My hands were shaking so bad I thought I'd never hold the rifle steady. And he leaned down and he said, 'Claire, the shaking isn't the enemy. The shaking is just your body caring about the outcome. You don't have to make it stop. You just have to make the shot around it.'" Pruitt stared at her. "So no," Claire said, "I'm not nervous. Or maybe I am, and it just doesn't matter anymore. Because I stopped fighting it a long time ago." Bannister called her name. "Whitmore." The whole line went silent, not the mocking silence of the first day, a different silence. The silence of men who had run out of ways to explain her away and were about to watch with their own eyes whether the story was true. Claire stood. She walked to the firing position with no hurry at all, the same unhurried walk that had driven Cole crazy on the very first ruck. And she settled behind the rifle the way a person settles into a chair they've owned for 30 years. And then she did nothing. For a long moment, she simply lay there and watched the wind. She watched the flags. She watched the grass bend and lift. She watched the dust. Bannister, standing off to the side, checked his watch, and Torres beside him gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent don't, because Torres had seen this before, in the stalking pits, and he knew that what looked like hesitation was actually the most dangerous thing on that entire range. It was patience. It was a shooter refusing to move until the moment was hers and not the wind's. 20 seconds passed. 30. A young candidate down the line shifted his weight, unable to bear the stillness. Bannister opened his mouth like he might say something, some jab about being slow, and then closed it, because even he could feel that something was happening out there, something he had spent his whole career trying to teach and had almost never seen done this well. The wind gusted. Claire waited. The wind died. Claire waited. And then in the half second when the flags went slack and the grass stood up straight and the air held its breath, Claire pressed the trigger. The round struck true, not close, not barely. Dead center. Nobody made a sound. She worked the bolt. She waited again. Another gust came and went, and she let it come and go, patient as stone. And in the next window of stillness, she fired again. And again, the round found the center of the target as if it had been called there. Then a third time, then a fourth, shot after shot. In the worst wind any of them had faced, while the strongest young men on that line had missed and cursed and chased their errors, Claire Whitmore placed round after round into the heart of the target with a calm that bordered on the supernatural. Cole was not breathing. He realized this only when his chest started to burn. He forced himself to exhale, and then came the last target. Bannister had saved it, and everyone knew he'd saved it, because it was set at a distance that the program only used to separate the merely excellent from the truly rare. It was a distance most of the candidates had never fired at. It was a distance that, in this wind, on this gray, restless morning, should have been impossible. Bannister walked over and stood almost directly behind her. It was not a coincidence. He wanted to see it up close. He wanted to see the exact moment she failed, because some part of him, the proud part, the part that had thrown her file across a table, still needed her to fail. And another part of him, the part that had sat awake in a dark office, reading a name he could not stop reading, was terrified that she wouldn't. "Long way out there, Captain," Bannister said low, just for her. "You sure you don't want to pass on this one? No shame in knowing your limit." Claire didn't take her eye off the target. "My grandfather never taught me where my limit was, Chief," she said. "He just taught me to keep going until I found it. I haven't found it yet." Something in Bannister's chest went tight. The wind out at that distance was a different animal than the wind at the line. Claire could see it in the way the far grass moved a half beat behind the near grass, in the way the dust told two different stories at two different ranges. This was the moment. This was everything the ranch had ever taught her, distilled down into one impossible shot in front of the men who had laughed. She closed her eyes. For just a second, she wasn't in Florida. She was 14 years old on a cold Montana ridge, her hands shaking, a predator somewhere below her that grown men had failed to find, and her grandfather's voice steady in her ear. "The shaking isn't the enemy. Make the shot around it. Anyone can pull a trigger. Only patient people understand when." She opened her eyes. She read the two winds, the near and the far. She made an adjustment so small that Bannister, standing right behind her, didn't even see her hand move. And then she waited one more time for the world to go still. The gust came. She let it pass. The flags dropped. The grass stood up. She fired. For a long, long second, nobody on that range breathed. The round was in the air, traveling that impossible distance through that dishonest wind, and every man on the line was leaning forward without knowing it, willing it, dreading it, needing to know. Then the sound came back to them across the distance. Impact. The target had been hit, and not on the edge, not by luck. Dead center at a range that had broken every assumption every one of them had carried onto that field. The silence held for one more heartbeat, and then it broke, not into cheering, but into something stranger and more honest. A low sound rolled down the line, the sound of a dozen young men exhaling at once, the sound of a story they had refused to believe finally becoming undeniable. Pruitt actually laughed, a short, disbelieving bark, and put his hand over his mouth. Delgado, who had failed so badly an hour before, was shaking his head slowly with something like awe. And Cole just stood there staring downrange at a target he had missed and she had centered from farther out, in the same wind, and he felt every word he had ever said about her come back and land on his shoulders all at once. Torres walked out to check the results, and when he came back, he didn't just report the score. He stopped in front of the whole formation and he said it loud. "That," Torres said, "is one of the finest shooting performances this program has seen. Not this class, this program, years of candidates. She's in the top handful of anyone who's ever come through here." Nobody argued. There was nobody left who could. Claire stood up from the firing position. She brushed the dirt from her sleeves, calm as ever. And she did not gloat, and she did not look at the men who had mocked her. And she did not say a single word about the bets, or the laughter, or the sweetheart, or any of it. She simply picked up her rifle and walked back toward the line as though she had done nothing more remarkable than tie her boots. But Bannister stopped her. He stepped into her path and the whole formation went still again, because this was the man who had thrown her file across a table. The man who had ridden her harder than anyone. The man who had promised to hold the door open the day she quit. And now he stood in front of her, and something was working in his face. Some struggle between 22 years of pride and the thing he had discovered in a dark office. "Whitmore," he said, his voice was rough. "Where's your family from?" It was a strange question to ask on a firing line. Claire studied him for a moment, and Cole, watching, got the sense that she understood exactly why he was asking. That she had understood for a while. "Montana, Chief," she said. "A ranch outside of a town too small to be on most maps." "And the man who raised you," Bannister said, and now his voice was almost careful, almost afraid. "The man who taught you to shoot. What was his name?" Claire said the name, and the effect on Bannister was something none of the young men had ever seen. The chief, the immovable chief, the man who had broken more candidates than anyone in the program's history, actually took a small step back. His face went pale, his mouth opened and closed. For a moment, he looked not like a hardened instructor, but like a young man himself, like a student who had just been told that the legend he'd worshipped his whole career was standing in front of him in the form of his granddaughter. "That's not possible," Bannister said quietly. "It's possible, Chief," Claire said. "He was my mother's father. He raised me after my parents passed. He's the one who put a rifle in my hands and taught me that patience was worth more than strength. He's the reason I'm standing on this range." She paused. "He passed 4 years ago, but I imagine you know his name. You've been using it." Bannister had. Every man on the line had heard it. For weeks, whenever Bannister wanted to shame a candidate, he had held up one legendary marksman as the impossible standard. He had spoken that name with reverence. He had built his whole authority on being connected, however distantly, to that legacy of excellence. And the woman he had mocked in front of the entire class, the woman he had called too old and too weak, the woman he had bet would quit by Friday, was that legend's blood. His student, his granddaughter, the living inheritor of the very standard Bannister worshipped. The chief stood there and you could see it moving through him, the full weight of what he had done. He had spent weeks mocking the one person in that program who carried the exact discipline he claimed to revere. He had laughed at the standard he'd built his career on, and he hadn't even known it. "I threw your file across a table," Bannister said. It was not quite an apology. Bannister did not know how to make one, but it was as close as a man like him could come. "You did," Claire said. There was no anger in her voice. There never had been. And that was the thing that had unsettled him from the very first day. "But I didn't come here for your approval, Chief. I came here to meet the standard. And the standard was never lowered. I had to reach it, same as everyone." Bannister looked at her for a long moment. Then slowly, in front of the whole formation, in front of every young man who had laughed, the chief did something none of them had ever seen him do. He nodded, just once. But it was the nod of one professional to another, of a man acknowledging that he had been wrong in a way that could not be walked back. "Fall in, Captain," he said quietly. Claire fell in. That night, the barracks were different. The jokes were gone. Nobody was taking bets. The young men who had spent weeks certain that a slot had been wasted on a woman too old for the job now lay in their bunks and thought about the top of the target, in the center of the target, and the difference between them. A difference measured not in strength or youth, but in patience, in discipline, in 20 years on a ranch. Cole couldn't take it anymore. He got up and he walked over to where Claire was sitting on the edge of her bunk, cleaning her rifle the way she cleaned it every night, and he stood there for a moment not knowing how to start. Claire looked up at him. "Say what you came to say, Cole," she said. Not unkind, just direct, the way she was about everything. Cole swallowed. "I thought you were here because someone lowered the standard," he said. "The first day. I said you'd cry. I bet money on it. I told everyone you were taking a slot from a guy who earned it." He stopped. His voice was thick. "I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it. I've never seen anybody shoot like that. I couldn't do what you did today. Not in that wind, not from out there, not even close." Claire set down her rifle. "The standard was never lowered," she said, the same words she'd given Bannister. "I had to reach it, just like you. The only difference between us, Cole, is that I've been reaching for it a lot longer. You're 26. You've been told your whole life you were the best in the room. That's a hard thing to carry, actually. It makes you trust your talent instead of your patience. I know because my grandfather made sure I never got told that. He made sure I always thought I had more work to do." She looked at him steadily. "You're good. You're genuinely good. But good gets people killed if it isn't married to patience. You lost that target today because you wanted it too bad. Learn to want it a little less and want to do it right a little more, and you'll be dangerous." Cole stared at her. It was, without question, the most useful thing anyone had said to him in the entire program, and it had come from the woman he'd bet $10 would cry. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, "after everything I said?" Claire almost smiled. "Because my grandfather helped me," she said, "and nobody teaches you patience by holding a grudge. Sit down, Cole. Let me show you how to read a wind that lies to you." And Cole, the loudest doubter in the whole program, sat down on the floor beside her bunk. And Claire Whitmore, 38 years old, too old and too weak in the eyes of a room that had laughed at her a month ago, began to teach him the thing her grandfather had taught her on a cold Montana ridge, a thing that no amount of youth or strength could ever replace. Across the barracks, Pruitt watched them, and something in his chest settled. He had been the first to ask her where she'd learned to move like that. He had felt in the mess hall weeks ago that he was one question away from something enormous. And now he understood. He had been sitting across from a legacy the whole time. But the wind and the target and the shot that changed everything had only settled the question of whether Claire belonged. It had not settled the harder question, the one that would come for her when she least expected it, the one that Bannister himself would put in front of her before the program was through. Because meeting the standard on a range with paper targets was one thing. Bannister had said as much on the very first week, standing too close, his voice pitched to carry across the room. Holding steady when it's real, when there's weight to it, that's a different animal. And Claire, cleaning her rifle in the quiet barracks, teaching a young man how to read a lying wind, did not yet know how soon and how completely that different animal was going to arrive. The different animal arrived on a Thursday, and it did not announce itself. It came in the form of a phone call to the training compound at 4 in the morning. And by the time the sun was up, The whole tone of the program had changed. Bannister gathered them in the briefing room, and the moment he walked in, every candidate knew that something was wrong. The chief's face was not the face of a man running a training exercise. It was the face of a man carrying something heavy. "This is not a drill," Bannister said, "so I'm going to say it once, and I'm going to say it plain." The room went dead quiet. "There's a real situation developing about 90 minutes from here," he said. "A hostage standoff. A man barricaded in a rural property with two people he's holding against their will. One of them is a child." He let that word sit in the room, and it landed on every candidate like a weight. "Local authorities are on scene. This is not our operation. I want to be absolutely clear about that. But we've received a request for observation and support, and because of where this training compound sits, and because of certain capabilities we have on hand, a small element is being asked to stage nearby, purely as a contingency." Cole shifted in his seat. Pruitt had gone pale. This was not paper targets anymore. "I need one shooter," Bannister said, "to stage with the support element, someone who can hold a position for hours, in real conditions, with real weight on the outcome, and be ready to act if the worst happens, and the professionals on scene need a resource they don't currently have. This is not glory. This is the opposite of glory. This is sitting in the cold for 6 hours praying you never have to do the thing you're there to do." He looked out over the room, and every candidate understood that he was about to make a choice, and every candidate understood, in the same instant, who he was going to choose. "Whitmore," Bannister said. Claire stood. "Yes, Chief." Bannister looked at her, and for a moment the whole history between them passed through the air. The file thrown across a table. The sweetheart. The bet that she'd quit by Friday. And then the target, dead center from an impossible distance, in a lying wind. And the name he'd worshipped his whole career standing in front of him in the form of this woman. "You said something to me on the range," Bannister said slowly. "You said your grandfather never taught you where your limit was. He just taught you to keep going until you found it." He paused. "I need to know something before I put you out there, and I need the truth, not the answer you think I want. Have you ever done the real thing? Not paper, not steel, the real thing where a life is in the balance and the weight is on you?" The room held its breath. This was the question Bannister had thrown at her weeks ago as a cruelty, standing too close, trying to make her flinch. "You ever taken a life, Captain? I think, you're going to freeze." Now he was asking it as a commander who had to know, because a child's life might depend on the answer. Claire was quiet for a long moment. "No, Chief," she said, "not the way you mean. I've made shots that mattered. When I was 14, there was a predator taking our livestock, and grown men had failed to stop it, and I stopped it. That was real, and there was weight to it, more than a 14-year-old should carry. But a human being on the other end of the rifle?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I've never done that. And I'll tell you the truth, Chief, since you asked for it, I don't want to. I've spent my whole life learning how to make a shot, and I've spent just as long hoping I'd never have to make that one." Bannister nodded slowly. It was not the confident answer of a young man trying to prove himself. It was something better. It was honest. "Good, Sean," he said. "The ones who want to are the ones I'd never send. Get your gear." 90 minutes later, Claire was in position, and the waiting began. The support element was small and professional, and they treated her with a respect that would have been unimaginable a month ago because the story of the range had traveled, and because Bannister had personally vouched for her in a way he had never vouched for anyone. She settled into her position with the same patience she'd carried onto the stalking field, the same stillness she'd learned on a Montana ridge, and she began to do the thing that the job actually was, underneath all the mythology. She waited. The hours crawled. Through her optic, at a careful distance, she could see the property, and she could see the negotiators working, and she could see the small movements at the windows that told the story of what was happening inside. A man, agitated, pacing, and twice, briefly, a smaller shape, the child. Every time Claire saw that small shape, something in her chest tightened, and she made herself breathe through it, made herself stay in the stillness. Because a shooter who lets her heart get ahead of her hands is a shooter who misses when it matters most. The radio crackled with updates. The negotiation was not going well. The man inside was unstable, making demands that made no sense, growing more erratic as the hours passed. Claire listened and watched and waited and did not move hour after hour until her body ached and her eyes burned. And still she did not move because her grandfather had taught her on a cold ridge a lifetime ago that the waiting was the job and the shot was only the last half second of a thing that took all day. Beside her, one of the support team members, a seasoned professional named Reyes, watched her with growing respect. "How long can you hold that position?" Reyes asked quietly during a lull. "As long as it takes," Claire said, not moving. "Everybody says that," Reyes said. "Then their body starts talking to them around hour 3, and they start shifting and stretching, and by hour 4, they're a mess." "My body started talking to me around hour 2, Claire said. "I just stopped listening. My grandfather used to say the discomfort is just your body trying to negotiate with you. You don't have to say no, you just have to stop taking the meeting." Reyes actually laughed softly despite the tension. "Where'd you learn that?" "Montana," Claire said. "A ranch and an old man who was better at this than anyone I've ever met." And then, in the 4th hour, everything changed at once. The radio came alive, sharp and urgent. The situation inside had deteriorated. The man had stopped responding to the negotiators. There were sounds from inside the property that suggested the worst, and the professionals on scene were moving toward a decision none of them wanted to make. Claire felt the whole atmosphere of the support element tighten, and she settled deeper behind her rifle, and she made herself very, very still. "Whitmore." It was Bannister's voice on the radio now, patched in, tight and controlled. "Talk to me. What do you see?" "Movement at the west window," Claire said, her voice flat and calm. "The male subject. Agitated. He's got something in his hand. Can't confirm what. The child was visible 30 seconds ago near the interior wall, then moved out of sight." "Copy," Bannister said. "Stand by. This is not your call to make. The professionals on scene have the authority. You are a contingency. Do you understand me, Whitmore? You do nothing unless you are directed, and even then, only if there is no other option and a life is in immediate danger. This is the line. Do not cross it on your own." "Understood, Chief," Claire said. "I hold until directed." And then, for the next several minutes, Claire Whitmore lived through the longest stretch of her entire life. Because the situation kept getting worse. The man inside moved to the window again, and this time Claire could see more clearly what was in his hand, and it was exactly what she had feared. And the negotiators' voices on the radio were losing their calm, and the professionals on scene were talking in the clipped, urgent language of people running out of options. And through it all, Claire held her position, held her breath, held the line Bannister had drawn, and did not move. The man dragged the child into view. Claire saw it through her optic, and her whole body wanted to act, every instinct screaming, and she did the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. Harder than any ruck, harder than any stalk, harder than the impossible shot on the range. She waited. She held the line. Because it was not her call, and a child's life was too important to be gambled on a shooter who acted on instinct instead of direction. "He's got the child at the window." Claire's voice was still calm, but there was something underneath it now, a controlled urgency that made everyone on the net go quiet. "He's using the child as a shield. I do not have a clean shot. I say again, I do not have a clean shot." "Hold," Bannister said. "Hold, Whitmore." Holding. And then the man made a mistake. In his agitation, in his rage, he shoved the child aside, back into the interior of the room, and for one moment, one single moment, he stood exposed in the window, with the weapon raised toward where the child had gone, and the professionals on scene saw it too, and the direction came down the net, sharp and immediate and final. "Green, green, you have authorization. Take the shot if you have it." The window was small. The distance was significant. The light was bad, and the man was moving, and there was maybe a second and a half before he turned that weapon back toward the child. And in that second and a half, Claire Whitmore did not think about any of the things a person might expect her to think about. She did not think about proving herself. She did not think about Bannister, or Cole, or the bet, or the laughter, or the word sweetheart. She did not think about being a woman, or being 38, or being too old, or any of it. She thought about a 14-year-old girl on a cold Montana ridge, hands shaking, an old man's voice steady in her ear. The shaking isn't the enemy. Make the shot around it. Anyone can pull a trigger. Only patient people understand when, and she understood when. She read the light. She read the small movement of the man in the window. She let out half a breath, exactly as she had 10,000 times before, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the last possible window before everything went wrong, she pressed the trigger. The shot was true. The threat was ended. The child was safe. For a long moment, there was nothing on the radio but silence. The stunned silence of a dozen professionals processing the fact that the worst had been prevented, that the child was alive, that it was over. And then the net came alive with the clipped confirmations of people doing their jobs, moving in, securing the scene, getting the child to safety. Claire did not move. She stayed in her position, exactly as she had for 4 hours. And she did not celebrate, and she did not shake, because the shaking was not the enemy, and she had made the shot around it. But something had shifted in her chest, something enormous and terrible and holy, because she had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had done the real thing, the thing she had spent her whole life hoping she would never have to do. And a child was alive because of it. Reyes beside her let out a long breath. "My God," Reyes said quietly, "in that window, in that light, at that distance." He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his face close to disbelief. "I've been doing this for 11 years. I'm not sure I make that shot. I'm not sure anybody I've ever worked with makes that shot." Claire didn't answer right away. She was still looking through her optic at the property, at the professionals moving in, at the small shape of the child being carried to safety. And when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "My grandfather taught me that the shot isn't the hard part," she said. "The hard part is everything before it. The 4 hours, the holding, the not moving when your whole body's screaming, the waiting until it's actually yours." She lowered her eye from the optic at last. "The trigger's the easy part, Reyes. It's the only part that takes half a second. Everything else is the job." Back at the compound, hours later, the mood was unlike anything the candidates had experienced. There was no training that day. There couldn't be. The whole program had learned, in fragments and then in full, what had happened out on that rural property, and what Claire Whitmore had done, and every young man who had once laughed at her now sat in a kind of stunned reverence, because the thing they had all wondered about, the thing Bannister had thrown in her face weeks ago as a cruelty, had been answered. She had done the real thing. She had held steady when there was weight to it. She had not frozen. A child was alive. When Claire finally walked back into the barracks, no one spoke at first, and then Pruitt stood up, and he didn't say anything. He just stood, and then Delgado stood, and then one by one, without a word, the entire barracks got to their feet. It was not applause. It was something quieter and deeper than applause. It was the way men stand when someone walks into a room who has done a thing they hope they never have to do, and done it right, and come back carrying the weight of it. Cole was the last to stand, but he stood. Claire looked at them, at all of them on their feet, and she did not know what to say, because she had never wanted this, any of this. She had never wanted to be a story. She had only ever wanted to meet the standard. "Sit down," she said finally, her voice rough. "Please, I'm not a hero. I did my job. That's all. I did the job I was trained for, and I got lucky that a good outcome was still possible when the moment came. Sit down." But they didn't sit down. Not right away. Because they understood something Claire was too humble to accept about herself, which was that luck had nothing to do with it, and that the difference between the child living and the child dying had been measured in the exact patience and discipline that a room full of young men had mocked a month before. That night, Bannister came to find her. He found her outside, alone in the dark, sitting with her back against a wall and her rifle beside her, staring at nothing. He knew that posture. He had held it himself years ago, after his own first time. He sat down beside her, slowly, an old man's knees complaining, and for a long while neither of them said anything at all. "It doesn't feel the way you think it's going to feel," Bannister said finally. "Nobody tells you that. You spend your whole career training for it, and then it happens, and it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a weight you're going to carry, the rest of your life. Yeah, Claire said quietly. It does. The child's alive because of you, Bannister said. You know that. You need to hold on to that because on the bad nights, and there will be bad nights, that's the thing that has to be bigger than the rest of it. The child's alive. That's the whole reason. That's the only reason any of us do this. Claire was quiet for a moment. My grandfather never talked about the times he had to do the real thing, she said. I knew he had. I could see it in him sometimes, on the quiet nights. But he never talked about it. Not once, not to me, not to anyone. And I used to wonder why. I used to think maybe it was because it didn't bother him. She let out a slow breath. I understand now. It wasn't that it didn't bother him. It was that it bothered him so much he couldn't put it into words. He carried it alone so that nobody else would have to carry it with him. Bannister looked at her in the dark. You know, he said, I spent 22 years holding your grandfather up as the standard nobody could reach. I used his name to break candidates. I told him, you'll never be as good as this man, and I meant it, because I believed it. He shook his head slowly, and then his granddaughter walked into my program, and I threw her file across the table, and I called her sweetheart, and I bet she'd quit by Friday. His voice was thick with something that a hard man rarely let himself feel. I've been chasing your grandfather's standard my whole career, Claire. And it turns out it walked right past me, and I laughed at it. Claire turned and looked at him. He wouldn't have held it against you, Chief, she said. You want to know the truth about my grandfather? He never once told me I was good. Not once. Every shot I ever made, no matter how impossible, he'd just nod and say, now do it again. He didn't believe in telling people they had arrived. He believed the second you think you've reached the standard is the second you stop reaching for it. She almost smiled. You held his name up as something nobody could reach. He would have loved that, because that's exactly what he thought the standard was for. Not to reach it, to keep you honest while you chase it. Bannister was quiet for a long time. I owe you an apology, he said finally. A real one. Not the half thing I gave you on the range. I was wrong about you in every way a man can be wrong about a person, and I'm sorry. Claire looked at him, and there was no triumph in her face, no vindication, none of the things a person might feel after being proven right so completely. I accept it, Chief, she said simply, but I need you to know he never needed it. I didn't come here for you to be wrong about me. I came here to meet the standard. The apology's for you, not for me. So if it helps you carry the wrong you did, take it, but don't hand it to me like a debt. I'm not keeping score. Bannister stared at her, and then slowly in the dark, the hardest man in the program, the man who had broken more candidates than anyone in his history, put his face in his hands, just for a moment, and let something go that he had been carrying for a very long time. And Claire sat beside him, and she did not say anything. Because some things a person has to carry to the ground and set down themselves. And the only kindness is to sit beside them while they do it. After a while, Bannister lifted his head. There's going to be a tension, he said. You understand that. What happened out there, a hostage rescue, a child saved? That doesn't stay quiet. There are going to be people who want to make you into something. A symbol, a story. And there are going to be people, plenty of them, who won't like that. A woman, a 38-year-old woman who was mocked in her own program, is the one who made that shot. They're going to come at you, Claire, from both sides, the ones who want to use you and the ones who want to tear you down. Claire nodded slowly. She had already understood this, somewhere in the back of her mind, Hermione, in the long hours of the drive back. Let them come, she said quietly. I've been underestimated my whole life, Chief. I know how to stand still while people decide what I am. I learned it from an old man on a ridge, a long time ago. She picked up her rifle and rose to her feet, an old ache in her knees now, too, and she looked down at Bannister in the dark. The target already answered the only question I ever cared about. Everything after this is just noise, and I stopped listening to noise around hour 2. She walked back inside, and Bannister sat alone in the dark for a long time, a hard man made softer by a single day, thinking about a name he had worshipped his whole life, and the woman who carried it, and understanding at last that the standard he had been chasing had never been about being the best shot in the room. It had been about being the kind of person who could do the hardest thing in the world and come back and refuse to call themselves a hero. It had been about patience and discipline and a stillness that no amount of youth or strength or noise could ever manufacture. It had been about her all along. The noise came exactly as Bannister had warned, and it came faster than anyone expected. Within a week, the story had escaped the compound. Not through Claire. She never said a word to anyone. But a hostage rescue in which a child was saved by a single shot does not stay in a small circle. And the details began to leak. And then the questions began, and then the calls. And by the second week, there was a name being spoken in offices far above the training program, a name attached to a story that certain people found very useful and certain other people found very threatening. Bannister came to her on a Tuesday morning with a look on his face that Claire had learned to read. "They want you in Washington," he said. Claire set down the rifle she'd been cleaning. "For what?" "Officially, a review of the incident," Bannister said. "Standard procedure after a shooting like that. But that's not really what it is." He sat down across from her, an old man's caution in the way he moved. "There are people who want to put you in front of cameras, Claire. There are people who want to turn you into a recruiting poster. The woman who was mocked in her own program and then saved a child's life. You understand how good that story looks on paper to the right kind of person." "And the other kind of person?" Claire asked because she already knew there was one. Bannister's jaw tightened. "There's a review officer," he said, "a colonel named Hargrove. He's built his whole career on standards, on the idea that the standards are sacred and can never bend for anyone. And he's got it in his head that your presence in that program, your success, is a threat to that idea. He thinks the only way a 38-year-old woman could have done what you did is if something got bent to let you in. And he's going to spend that review trying to prove it." Claire was quiet for a moment. "He thinks I'm the bent standard," she said. "He thinks you're proof that the standard bent," Bannister said. "And he's going to try to make you admit it, in front of people who matter. He's going to try to turn the best thing you've ever done into evidence that something's wrong with the whole system." He leaned forward. "I've known Hargrove for 20 years, Claire. He's not stupid and he's not entirely wrong to worry about standards. But he's decided the answer is you. And once that man decides something, he doesn't let go." Claire picked her rifle back up. She looked at it for a long moment. "Then I'll go tell him the truth," she said simply. "The standard was never lowered. I reached it, same as I've been saying since the first day. If the truth threatens his idea of standards, Chief, then his idea of standards was never as strong as he thought." The review took place in a room that felt designed to make a person feel small, and Colonel Hargrove sat at the center of it, a lean, precise man with the cold patience of someone who had spent his life winning arguments by wearing people down. He had a folder in front of him, and Claire recognized it because it was her folder, the same folder Bannister had once thrown across a table, and she understood immediately that Hargrove had studied it the way a prosecutor studies a case. "Captain Whitmore," Hargrove began, "thank you for coming. I want to be clear at the outset that this is not an adversarial proceeding. This is simply a review to ensure that everything about the incident and about your presence in the program meets the standards this institution holds sacred." "Of course, Colonel," Claire said. "I'm happy to answer anything." Hargrove opened the folder. "You're 38 years old." "I am. The average age of a candidate in your program is 26. You were the oldest candidate in the program's recent history. Is that correct?" "I don't have access to the full records, Colonel," Claire said, "but I don't doubt it. I was aware I was the oldest. Everyone made sure I was aware." Hargrove's eyes flicked up at that, but he pressed on. "You'll understand that this raises questions. This is one of the most physically demanding programs the military operates. It is designed to select for the peak of human physical capability. And yet you, at 38, an age at which most candidates would be considered past their prime, not only completed it but excelled. You'll forgive me if I find that difficult to accept at face value." There it was, the whole review laid out in the open. Hargrove was not there to understand what she had done. He was there to explain it away. "What is it you're finding difficult to accept, Colonel?" Claire asked. Her voice was calm, level, the same voice she'd used with Bannister on the first day. "That I completed it, or that I excelled?" "Both," Hargrove said. "Frankly, in my experience, when something appears too good to be true, it usually is. So I'll ask you directly, Captain, and I'll ask you to answer honestly. Was any standard at any point adjusted, waived, or lowered to accommodate your participation in this program? The room went quiet. This was the trap. If she said yes, she confirmed his theory. If she said no, he would spend the next hour trying to catch her in a contradiction. Claire understood the shape of it perfectly, and she was not afraid because she had spent a lifetime being asked to prove she belonged in rooms that had already decided she didn't. No, Colonel, she said, no standard was adjusted, waived, or lowered for me. Not once. I know that for a fact, and I'll tell you how I know it. Because Chief Bannister, the man who ran that program, spent the first 3 weeks of it absolutely certain that I didn't belong. He threw my file across the table. He called me sweetheart. He bet out loud in front of the whole class that I'd quit by Friday. Does that sound to you, Colonel, like a man who was lowering standards to help me? Or does it sound like a man who was daring me to fail? Hargrove's expression didn't change, but something in the room shifted. So you're telling me, Hargrove said, that you faced additional hostility and still succeeded. I'm telling you I faced the standard, Claire said, the full standard, and on top of the standard, I faced the certainty of every man in that room that I couldn't meet it. If anything, Colonel, the standard was harder for me than for anyone, because I had to meet it while carrying the extra weight of everyone waiting for me to fail. Nobody lowered anything. If you want to check, ask Chief Bannister. Ask the instructor named Torres, who watched me clear the land navigation course clean while stronger, younger candidates got lost. Ask any of them. The record's the record. The targets don't lie. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. He had expected defensiveness or nerves, or the careful evasions of someone with something to hide. He had not expected this, a calm, direct recitation of fact, delivered without heat, by a woman who did not seem to need his approval at all. Let's talk about the incident, Hargrove said, changing tack. The shooting. You were a training candidate, and yet you were placed in an operational contingency role in a live hostage situation. That is, to put it mildly, irregular. Some would say dangerously irregular. A candidate, not a qualified operator, in a position to take a human life. That's fair, Claire said. It was irregular. I won't pretend otherwise. Hargrove blinked. He had expected her to defend it. You agree that it was irregular, he said slowly. I agree completely, Claire said. I was a candidate. I had never done the real thing, and I was placed in a position where I might have to. That's irregular, and it's worth reviewing, and honestly, Colonel, I hope you do review it, because no candidate should be put in that position lightly, but you should know how it happened, because the how matters. She leaned forward slightly. Chief Bannister asked me directly before he sent me out whether I had ever taken a life, and I told him the truth. I said no, and I said I didn't want to, and he told me that the ones who want to are the ones he'd never send. He didn't send me because I was eager, Colonel. He sent me because I wasn't. Hargrove was silent, and when I was out, Claire continued, I held the line. For 4 hours, I did not act on my own. When the man used the child as a shield, I did not take an uncertain shot, because I would rather have failed the mission than risk that child's life on a shot I wasn't sure of. I only fired when I received authorization from the professionals on scene, and only when I had a shot I knew, absolutely knew, I could make. That's not a candidate acting recklessly, Colonel. That's the most disciplined thing I've done in my life, and a child is alive because of it. The room was very quiet now. Hargrove looked down at the folder, and then he did the thing that Claire had been waiting for. The thing she'd known was coming since Bannister first said his name. That's a compelling account, Captain, Hargrove said. But here's my difficulty. It's your account, and accounts, however compelling, can be shaped. He closed the folder. The truth is, I've seen careers built on single dramatic moments. A story that's too good, that flatters the institution in exactly the way the institution wants to be flattered. The mocked woman who becomes the hero. It's a story that makes people feel good. And stories that make people feel good are exactly the stories we should examine most carefully, because they are the ones we most want to believe without checking. He fixed her with a cold look. How do I know, Captain, that this isn't a story that's been shaped to be exactly as inspiring as it is? And there it was, the real accusation, finally in the open. Not that she'd failed to meet the standard, that she'd manufactured a legend. Claire looked at him for a long moment, and when she answered, her voice was quieter than before, but somehow it filled the whole room. "Colonel, you want to know how you can be sure this isn't a shaped story," she said. "Here's how. Because I don't want it to be a story at all. You think I want cameras? You think I want to be a recruiting poster? I've spent this whole review trying to tell you the same thing I've told everyone since the first day. I didn't come here to be a symbol. I came to meet the standard. The people who want to make me into an inspiring story, and the people, like you, who want to make me into a manufactured lie, you're doing the exact same thing. You're both trying to make me into something other than what I am. And what I am, Colonel, is a person who did her job." Hargrove's jaw tightened. "I killed a man," Claire said, and her voice cracked just slightly for the first time in the entire review, and the crack was more convincing than any composure could have been. "Do you understand that? I ended a human life. I'll carry that until the day I die. It doesn't feel like a story to me. It feels like a weight. And you're sitting there trying to decide whether I made it inspiring enough to be suspicious? And I'm telling you, Colonel, I would give anything for it to have never happened at all. I'd trade every bit of the attention, every camera, every poster, to not carry what I carry now. So no, it's not a shaped story, because nobody shapes a story that costs them this much." For the first time, Colonel Hargrove had nothing to say. The silence stretched, and in that silence, something happened that Claire had not expected. The door at the back of the room opened, and Chief Bannister walked in. He was not scheduled to be there. This was a closed review. But Bannister walked in anyway, in his dress uniform, 22 years of experience on his chest, and he came to attention in front of Colonel Hargrove. And he said, "Colonel, I request permission to make a statement." Hargrove frowned. "Chief, this is a closed proceeding." "I'm aware, sir," Bannister said, "and I'll accept whatever consequences come from my being here. But I ran that program. I made the decision to send Captain Whitmore into that contingency. If anyone's judgment is on trial in this room, it should be mine, not hers. So I'm asking permission to speak, sir, as the man responsible." Hargrove studied him for a long moment. "Speak," he said finally. And Bannister turned, not to Hargrove, but to the room. And he did the thing that a hard, proud man almost never does. He told the whole truth about himself. "I threw this woman's file across a table," Bannister said. "The first day, I called her sweetheart. I told her she'd quit by Friday, and I meant it because I was certain, absolutely certain, that a 38-year-old woman had no business in my program. I have spent 22 years believing I could tell, just by looking, who belonged and who didn't. And I looked at Captain Whitmore, and I was as wrong as I have ever been about anything in my life." He paused, and his voice was rough. "You want to know if a standard was lowered for her, Colonel? I'll tell you, I raised it. I made it harder for her than for anyone because I wanted her gone, and she met every bit of it. She cleared the land navigation course clean while my best young candidates got lost. She held a stalking position for 2 hours when men half her age failed in minutes. She put rounds dead center at a distance in a wind that broke every other shooter on the line. And then I sent her, a candidate, into a live situation. Because in 22 years of running that program, I have never, not once, seen anyone with her discipline. Not one candidate. And I'd been holding up a legend as the standard nobody could reach that whole time." His voice dropped. "It turns out the legend I was worshiping was her grandfather. She's his blood, his student. The standard I told a generation of candidates they'd never reach walked into my program, and I called her sweetheart." The room was utterly silent. "So if you want to strip someone of their credibility in this review, Colonel," Bannister said, "strip mine. I'm the one who was wrong. She's the one who was right the whole time, and she never once asked anyone to believe her. She just kept meeting the standard until there was nothing left to argue about. That's not a shaped story. That's the truth, and I watched all of it, and I'll put my 22 years behind every word." Hargrove looked from Bannister to Claire and back again, and slowly the cold certainty in his face began to give way, not to warmth. Hargrove was not a warm man, but to something else, to doubt. And for a man like Hargrove, doubt was the beginning of honesty. "Chief," Hargrove said quietly, "you understand that by coming in here and saying this, You've admitted to sending a training candidate into a live operational shooting. That's a serious admission. There could be consequences for you. I understand that completely, sir, Bannister said. And I'd make the same decision again. Because a child is alive. That's the only math that matters to me. Whatever it cost me, I made the right call sending her, and I'd rather lose my career than let you sit here and turn the best shot I've ever seen into a lie to protect an idea about standards. Standards aren't sacred because they never bend, Colonel. They're sacred because people like her meet them when everyone says they can't. For a long moment, nobody spoke. And then Colonel Hargrove did something that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. He closed the folder and he pushed it slightly away from him, and he sat back in his chair. I came into this review, Hargrove said slowly, believing that a story this good had to be too good to be true. That's been my whole career, Captain, distrusting the flattering story, and it's served me well mostly because most flattering stories are exactly as false as I suspect them to be. He looked at Claire directly. But I think I've made an error. I think I confused two different things. I confused a story that's too good to be true with a story that's simply better than I expected. And those aren't the same thing. The first is a lie. The second is just a person exceeding the low expectations someone placed on them. Claire said nothing. She had learned a long time ago when to stay silent and let the truth do its own work. You didn't shape a legend, Captain, Hargrove said. You met a standard, and the standard happened to make a compelling story, and I mistook the story for the cause when it was only ever the effect. He was quiet for a moment. I owe you an apology, and I owe Chief Bannister a conversation about the contingency decision, which was irregular, and which we will review properly on its own terms without dragging your name through it. But that's a separate matter, and it should never have been tangled up with the question of whether you belong. You belong. The record makes that plain. I let my suspicion of a good story blind me to a simple fact, and I'm sorry. Claire nodded slowly. I accept it, Colonel, she said. And then, because it was true, and because she was tired of being made into things she wasn't, she added, but I'll tell you what I told Chief Bannister. I never needed you to believe me. I came here to meet the standard, and I met it, and whether you believed me or not didn't change what the targets already said. Your belief is for you, not for me. If it helps you trust your standards a little more honestly, take it. But I'm not keeping score. Hargrove looked at her for a long moment, and something almost like respect crossed his lean, cold face. Your grandfather, he said, the legend. What was he like? And Claire, for the first time in the entire review, almost smiled. He never told me I was good, she said. Not once. Every shot I made, no matter how hard, he'd just nod and say, now do it again. He believed the second you think you've reached the standard is the second you stop reaching for it. He'd have hated all of this, Colonel, the review, the cameras, the people who want to make me a poster. He'd have looked at all of it and said, none of that has anything to do with whether you can make the shot. Go do it again. She paused. That's the only standard I've ever cared about. His. And his was harder than yours will ever be, because his never let me arrive. The review ended not long after that, and when Claire and Bannister walked out of that cold room together, into the hallway, Bannister let out a long breath, the breath of a man who had walked in expecting to lose his career and had walked out having gotten to say the truest thing he'd ever said. You didn't have to do that, Claire said quietly. Come in there, put yourself on the line like that. Yeah, I did, Bannister said. You want to know why? Because for 3 weeks I mocked you, and you never once mocked me back. Not when the targets proved you right. Not when the whole barracks stood up for you. Not ever. You had every right to rub my face in it, Claire. And you never did. And a man remembers who had the chance to humiliate him and chose not to. He stopped walking and looked at her. Your grandfather taught you how to shoot, but somebody taught you how to be decent about it. And that's the harder lesson, and the one more people should learn. Claire looked at him. He taught me that too, she said. Same day, actually. Same ridge. He said, Claire, the shot is going to make people afraid of you, and you're going to have to spend the rest of your life proving that they don't need to be. That's the real work, he said. Any fool can be good at something. Being good at something and staying kind, that's the thing almost nobody manages. She started walking again. I've been trying my whole life, Chief, Some days I do better than others. Bannister walked beside her in silence for a moment. There's still going to be noise, he said. Hargrove backing off doesn't make it go away. The people who want to make you a symbol are still out there. This isn't over. I know, Claire said, but I've decided something out there in that review. I'm not going to let either side have me. Not the ones who want to worship me and not the ones who want to tear me down. I'm going to do the one thing my grandfather actually respected. I'm going to go back and I'm going to teach. Because there are young soldiers coming up right now who are being told they don't belong, the same way I was told. And I'd rather spend the rest of my life handing his lessons down to them than one more day standing in front of a camera being something I'm not. Bannister stopped walking. You want to come back, he said, as an instructor in my program. If you'll have me, Claire said. And Chief Bannister, the man who had thrown her file across a table, the man who had called her sweetheart and bet she'd quit by Friday, looked at Captain Claire Whitmore for a long moment in that quiet hallway, and there was something in his eyes that no candidate had ever seen there before. Captain, he said, his voice thick, it would be the honor of my career. She had thought the young men who had once mocked her would receive the news of the review the way people receive gossip, with curiosity and a little distance. But when she walked back through the gates 3 days after Washington, what she found waiting for her was something else entirely. Pruitt was the first to reach her, and he didn't say anything about the review, or the colonel, or the cameras that were apparently circling somewhere out beyond the fence line. He just said, they tried to say you didn't earn it, didn't they? Claire set down her bag, something like that. And you told them the truth, Pruitt said. It wasn't a question. I told them the standard was never lowered, Claire said. Same as I've been telling everyone since the first day. Pruitt nodded slowly, and there was something working in his young face, some anger on her behalf that Claire found unexpectedly moving. It's not right, he said. You did the hardest thing any of us can imagine, and instead of a handshake, they put you in a room and tried to prove you cheated. It's not right, Captain. No, Claire agreed quietly. It's not right, but it's not new either, Pruitt. There's always going to be somebody whose idea of the world can't survive you succeeding in it. And when that happens, they don't change their idea. They come after you instead. The trick isn't avoiding those people. You can't. The trick is refusing to become bitter when they arrive, because bitterness is the one thing that actually does make you smaller. She picked her bag back up. Hargrove wanted to shrink me. If I'd walked out of that room angry, he'd have won, no matter what the review concluded. I walked out the same size I walked in. That's the only victory that matters. Word of that exchange traveled too, the way everything traveled in a small compound. And by that evening, the whole class understood something about Claire Whitmore that they had only half grasped before. It was one thing to make an impossible shot. Plenty of people over the years had made impossible shots. It was another thing entirely to be doubted, mocked, investigated, and nearly stripped of your own achievement, and to come through all of it without a single drop of poison in you. That was the part they couldn't stop thinking about. Cole came to find her that night. He had changed more than any of them over the weeks, and it showed in the way he approached her now, without swagger, without the need to fill the silence. I heard Bannister walked into that review, Cole said. Put his whole career on the line for you. He did, Claire said. The same guy who threw your file across the table. The same guy. Cole shook his head slowly, sitting down on the floor beside her bunk, the same spot he'd sat weeks ago when she first taught him to read a lying wind. I don't get it, he admitted. A month ago, he wanted you gone. I wanted you gone. And now he's ready to lose everything for you. How does that happen? How does a person change that fast? Claire considered the question seriously, because it was a serious question, and because Cole was asking it about himself as much as about Bannister. He didn't change fast, she said finally. That's the thing people always get wrong. It looks fast from the outside. One day the man hates you, the next day he's defending you in front of a colonel. But it wasn't fast, Cole. It happened one small thing at a time. The land nav course, the stalking pits, the range, the child. Every one of those was a little crack in the wall he'd built. And walls don't fall all at once. They fall one crack at a time until one day the last crack goes and the whole thing comes down. and from the outside it looked sudden. But it was never sudden. It was just patient, same as everything else. Cole was quiet for a moment. "That's why you never fought back," he said slowly. It was dawning on him, the whole shape of it. "You never argued with any of us. You never tried to convince us. You just kept meeting the standard over and over, putting cracks in the wall, and you let it fall on its own." "You can't argue somebody out of a belief they didn't argue themselves into," Claire said. "Bannister didn't decide I couldn't do the job because of evidence. He decided it because of what I look like. And you can't fight what somebody looks like with words. You can only fight it with the one thing they can't explain away. The targets, the record, the clean course, the centered shot. I let those do the talking because they're more patient than I am, and they never lose their temper." Cole let out a slow breath and looked at her with something close to wonder. "My whole life," he said, "I've won every argument by being louder, being faster, getting my shot in first. And you won the biggest argument I've ever seen by not saying anything at all." Claire almost smiled. "Your grandfather teach you to argue like that?" "My father," Cole said. "He was a salesman, best in the state 3 years running. He used to say, 'The man who talks last loses.'" "Mine used to say the opposite," Claire said. "He'd say, 'The man who has to talk at all has already lost.' The truth doesn't need a spokesman, Claire. It just needs somebody patient enough to let it show up." She looked at Cole, and her voice softened. "You're going to be a fine shooter, Cole. You've got the talent, and you're finally learning the patience. But if you want to know the thing that'll actually carry you, it's not either of those. It's learning to let the truth show up on its own. You'll waste half your life fighting battles that would have won themselves if you just held still." Cole sat with that for a long time. And then he asked the question that had been sitting under everything, the one he hadn't quite had the courage to ask. "Do you forgive me?" he said. "For the first day, the bet, all of it." Claire looked at him, and there was no hesitation in her at all. "There's nothing to forgive, Cole," she said. "You were 26, and you'd been told your whole life you were the best, and a woman walked into your world who didn't fit your idea of who belonged there. That's not a sin. That's just being young and certain, and everybody's guilty of it about something. The only real question was never whether you'd doubt me. Everybody doubted me. The only real question was what you'd do when the doubt turned out to be wrong. And you sat down on this floor and you said, 'I was wrong, and you asked me to teach you.' That's the whole ball game right there. Most people, when their doubt gets proven wrong, dig in harder. You didn't. You changed. That's rarer than any shot I've ever made." Cole's lower throat worked, and for a moment the confident young man looked very young indeed. "Thank you, Captain," he managed. "Don't thank me," Claire said. "Just do the thing my grandfather always said. Do it again. Be that guy again next time. The guy who can say he was wrong. You'll get a lot of chances in this life, Cole. Take every one of them." The days that followed carried a strange weight. The attention Bannister had warned about did not evaporate. There were calls to the compound, requests for interviews, a persistent pressure from somewhere high up to bring Claire out into the light and make her into the symbol certain people wanted her to be. She refused all of it, quietly, without drama, the same way she did everything. And the refusals themselves became a kind of statement, because in a world where almost everyone said yes to the cameras, a woman who kept saying no became, ironically, even more compelling to the people who wanted her. Bannister watched it happen with a grim understanding. "They're not going to stop," he told her one evening. "The more you refuse, the more they want you. You understand that. Your no is making you into exactly the thing you're trying not to become." "I know," Claire said, "but I'd rather be made into a symbol by my silence than by my cooperation. At least this way, whatever they turn me into, I didn't help them do it. My grandfather used to say, 'You can't always stop people from telling lies about you, but you can make sure you never handed them the pen.'" She was quiet for a moment. "Let them build whatever they want out there, Chief. I'll be in here teaching. That's the only version of me I actually control." And that, in the end, was the decision that defined her. Not the shot, not the review. The choice, made quietly and kept faithfully, to turn away from the version of herself that the world wanted to manufacture, and to spend her time instead on the thing her grandfather would have respected. The work, the teaching, the passing down. There was one more conversation before that chapter closed that Claire would carry with her for the rest of her life. Colonel Hargrove came to the compound. Unannounced, nobody expected it, least of all Claire. He arrived in civilian clothes, which somehow made him seem smaller and more human than he had in that cold review room. And he found her outside, cleaning her rifle in the last of the daylight, the way she cleaned it every evening. "Captain," he said. Claire looked up. "Colonel." "I'm not here in any official capacity," Hargrove said. He seemed uncomfortable, a precise man operating outside his precision. "I've been thinking about our conversation, about what I said and what you said back, and I found I couldn't quite let it go." He paused. "You said something. You said I was doing the same thing as the people who wanted to make you a symbol, that we were both trying to make you into something other than what you were. I've been chewing on that for 2 weeks, and I've decided you were right. And I don't like being wrong, Captain, so I wanted to come tell you in person." Claire set down her rifle. "That took something, Colonel. Coming here to say that." "It's the least I owed you," Hargrove said. He looked out at nothing for a moment. "Can I tell you something? Off the record. Between two people, not two ranks." "Of course. I spent 30 years defending standards," Hargrove said. "It was my whole identity, the man who wouldn't let anything bend. And I told myself that made me the guardian of something important. But sitting in that review, listening to you, I realized something I didn't want to realize." His voice grew quieter. "I wasn't protecting the standard. I was protecting my idea of who could meet it. Those aren't the same thing. The standard doesn't care who meets it. Only I cared, and I dressed up my prejudice in the language of rigor, and I called it integrity for 30 years. He looked at her. "You were the first person who ever made me see the difference. And I think if I'm honest, I came out here to thank you for it, even though it cost me something to learn." Claire was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, there was a gentleness in her voice that she rarely let anyone see. "My grandfather would have liked you, Colonel," she said. "You want to know why? Because you did the hardest thing a person can do. You looked at a belief you'd carried for 30 years, and you found the flaw in it, and instead of defending it, you set it down. Most people would rather he die than do that. You did it in 2 weeks, and then you drove out here to say it to my face." She almost smiled. "He'd have handed you a rifle and said, 'Now do it again,' because that's what he did with anything he respected. He asked you to prove it wasn't a fluke." Hargrove let out something that was almost a laugh. "Now do it again," he repeated. "I think I'd have liked him too." "Everybody did," Claire said. "That was the strange thing about him. He was the hardest man I ever knew, and the kindest, and somehow both at the same time. He'd tear your shooting apart until you wanted to cry. And then he'd sit with you on the porch until midnight because he could see you were hurting about something that had nothing to do with rifles. I spent my whole childhood trying to understand how a person could be both. I think I finally get it now." She looked at Hargrove. The hardness was for the work. The kindness was for the person. He never mixed them up. Most people do. Most people are hard on the person and easy on the work. And it should be the other way around. Hargrove stood there in the fading light, a precise man undone a little by a truth he hadn't come looking for. "Hard on the work, easy on the person," he said slowly. 30 years, Captain. I had it exactly backwards for 30 years. "You've got time to fix it," Claire said. "That's the good news about being wrong, Colonel Mom. It's never too late to be right. My grandfather was still fixing his own mistakes when he passed, and he was 81. Said he'd finally figured out how to be patient somewhere around 70. She picked her rifle back up. "Go be right, Colonel. You've got the years. Don't waste them defending the wrong thing." Hargrove nodded, and for a moment the two of them stood in a silence that had nothing cold in it at all. Then he turned to go and stopped and turned back. "They're going to keep coming for you," he said. "You know that. The ones who want to use you, and the ones like I was, who won't be able to stand that you exist. I can't protect you from all of them. But I want you to know, Captain, that if it ever comes to another room, another review, another attempt to take from you what you earned, you send for me. I'll walk into that room the way Bannister walked into mine. That's a promise from a man who doesn't make them lightly." Claire looked at him, and something passed between them. The strange and unlikely respect of two people who had started as adversaries and ended as something better. "Thank you, Colonel," she said. "But you should know, I don't need protecting. I never have. I've been standing still while people decide what I am since I was 14 years old on a Montana ridge. I know how to outlast them. The ones who come for me always tire out eventually because their anger runs on hating me, and hate is exhausting, and my patience runs on nothing at all. It just keeps going." She almost smiled. "But I appreciate the promise, and I'll remember it. It's good to know which rooms have a friend in them." Hargrove left as quietly as he'd come, and Claire sat in the last of the light, cleaning her rifle, thinking about walls that fall one crack at a time, about a colonel who'd carried the wrong thing for 30 years and set it down in 2 weeks, about a hard, kind old man on a Montana ridge who'd taught her everything except how to want the fame that was now chasing her through the fence line. She thought about the young men in the barracks, the ones who'd stood up for her without a word, the ones who'd learned to say they were wrong. She thought about Cole, learning to let the truth show up on its own. She thought about Bannister, who'd been ready to lose his career rather than let a good story be turned into a lie. And she understood, sitting there in the fading light, that the shot had never been the point. The shot was only ever the half second at the end. Everything that mattered had happened in the hours around it, in the patience, in the refusing to become bitter, in the choosing again and again to be hard on the work and easy on the people. That was the standard, not the one on the range, the other one, the harder one, the one her grandfather had spent his whole life trying to meet, and had passed down to her the only way a thing like that can be passed down, not in words, but in the daily patient example of a life lived that way. She finished cleaning her rifle. She set it down. And Captain Claire Whitmore sat alone in the last light of the day, at peace in a way that no camera could capture and no review could take away, ready for whatever came next, because she had already survived the only thing that had ever truly been a test. Not the range, not the child, not the colonel. The test of staying kind while the world decided what she was. And she had passed it the same way she passed everything, quietly, patiently, one crack at a time. The new class arrived on a Monday, and among them was a girl who reminded Claire of herself so completely that it hurt. Her name was Diaz, and she was 24, and she walked into the compound with her shoulders squared against a hostility she could already feel coming, the way Claire had squared hers against Bannister on the first day. Claire recognized it instantly, that particular armor a person builds when they've spent their whole life walking into rooms that decided they didn't belong before they said a word. And she recognized something else too in the way the other candidates looked at Diaz, the same doubt, the same quiet certainty that a slot had been wasted, the same laughter waiting just behind their teeth. Claire stood at the front of the briefing room now where Bannister had once stood, and she watched it all happen, and she understood that the wheel had come all the way around. "Some of you," Claire said, "are looking at the people next to you right now and deciding who's going to make it and who isn't. I know you are, because I did the same thing when I was in your seats. And I want to tell you something before we begin, so you don't waste any more time on it." She let her eyes move across the room. "You can't tell. You cannot tell by looking who's going to be standing here at the end. I've watched the strongest man in a class quit in week 2. I've watched people that everybody wrote off outlast every single person who doubted them. The one thing I've learned in all my years doing this is that the people who look least like they belong are very often the ones who've been preparing for this their whole lives, in ways you can't see and they'll never tell you about." A candidate near the front, a big, confident young man not unlike Cole had once been, shifted in his seat. "How do you know, ma'am?" he asked, and there was just a trace of challenge in it. "How do you know who's been preparing?" Claire looked at him for a long moment. "Because I was the one nobody believed in," she said simply. "I walked into this program at 38 years old, and the man who ran it threw my file across the table and bet I'd quit by Friday. Every single person in the room laughed, and I want you to understand something, son. I wasn't offended, because I knew something they didn't. I knew where I came from. I knew what I'd already survived to get into that room. And I knew that the targets wouldn't care about a single opinion in that building." She paused. "So when I ask you not to decide who belongs, I'm not asking you to be nice. I'm asking you to be smart. Because the person you write off today might be the one who saves your life someday, and you'll have spent all your energy laughing at them instead of learning from them. The room was very quiet, and Diaz in the back looked at the woman standing at the front, and something in her armored shoulders eased just slightly because she had walked in expecting to face this alone, the way she'd faced everything alone, and she had just discovered that the person in charge had walked the exact same road. Claire found her after the briefing. "Diaz," she said, "walk with me." The girl fell into step beside her, wary, waiting for the catch, the way people do when they've learned that kindness usually comes with a bill attached. "You feel it already," Claire said, "the way they look at you." Diaz's jaw tightened. "I'm used to it, ma'am." "I know you are," Claire said. "That's the problem. You've gotten so used to it that you've built your whole self around it. I can see it in the way you walk. You're carrying a fight into every room before anyone's thrown a punch. And I need you to understand something, because it's the most important thing I'll ever teach you, and it's got nothing to do with rifles." She stopped walking and looked at the young woman directly. "That armor you're wearing, it's going to get you through the door, but it's going to keep you from getting through the program. Because the thing this job actually requires is stillness, patience, the ability to empty yourself out and become part of the ground. And you can't do that while you're braced for a fight. The armor and the stillness can't live in the same body." Diaz stared at her. "Then how am I supposed to protect myself?" "You're not," Claire said. "That's the hard part. You stop protecting yourself. You let them think whatever they're going to think, and you stop spending 1 ounce of energy on it, and you put every bit of that energy into the work instead. The doubt is going to be there no matter what you do, so you have 2 choices. You can spice your strength fighting the doubt, or you can spend your strength meeting the standard. You can't do both. I chose the standard, and 1 crack at a time, the doubt fell down on its own." She put a hand on the girl's shoulder. "My grandfather told me that when I was 14, Diaz, he said the world is going to try to make you into a fighter, and if it succeeds, you'll lose. Be still instead. Stillness outlasts everything." Diaz was quiet for a long moment, and then, in a voice smaller than the armor had let anyone hear before, she said, "I don't know if I can do that, ma'am. Be still. I've been fighting my whole life." "I know," Claire said gently. "So had I. And I'll tell you what my grandfather told me. You don't have to know if you can. You just have to try it once and see what happens, and then try it again. That's all patience ever is. It's not a thing you have. It's a thing you practice, 1 moment at a time, until one day you look up and it's who you are." She smiled just slightly. "Now do it again, Diaz. That's the whole secret. Whatever you manage today, tomorrow you do it again." Over the weeks that followed, Claire watched Diaz struggle with exactly the things she'd named, the armor and the stillness fighting for the same body. She watched the girl rush the land navigation course out of a need to prove herself and get lost, the same way the young men had once gotten lost. She watched her fail the stalking exercise the first time, moving too fast, too eager to show she could do it. And each time, Claire didn't scold her. She just crouched down beside her afterward and said, in her grandfather's voice, "Now do it again." And slowly, 1 crack at a time, Diaz began to change. The turning point came in the stalking pits, in the 6th week, when Diaz spent 3 hours moving in inches across open ground, and the observers could not find her. And Claire stood at the line watching with her arms crossed and something rising in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel so strongly. When the girl finally took her shot from a position closer than anyone in the class had managed, and the observers startled, Claire had to turn away for a moment because her eyes had gone hot, and she did not want the candidates to see, because she was not watching Diaz. She was watching herself 20 years ago. She was watching her grandfather's lesson travel forward through time, from a Montana ridge, through a scared 14-year-old girl, through a mocked 38-year-old captain, into a 24-year-old woman who had just learned that stillness outlasts everything. That night, Diaz found her. "I did it," Diaz said, and there was wonder in her voice, and something else, something like the first real peace the girl had felt in years. "I stopped fighting out there. I just stopped, and I became part of the ground, like you said. And ma'am, for the first time in my whole life, I wasn't bracing for anything. I was just there." Her voice caught. "I didn't know it could feel like that. I didn't know you could be safe without armor." Claire looked at her, and there were no words for what she felt. So she said the only ones that mattered. "That's the whole thing, Diaz," she said quietly. "That's what my grandfather spent his life trying to teach me, and what I've spent my life trying to teach anyone who'd listen. The armor was never protecting you. It was just weighing you down. And the moment you set it down, you found out you were stronger without it than you ever were carrying it." She reached out and squeezed the girl's shoulder. "Now do it again, tomorrow and the day after and every day until it's just who you are. That's the only assignment I'll ever really give you." Diaz nodded, her eyes wet, and for a moment the two of them stood in the quiet, two women who had walked the same hard road 2 decades apart, one at the end of it and one just beginning. The story of Claire Whitmore did not stay contained. Bannister had been right about that all those months ago. The attention never fully faded, and over the years it grew into something larger than any single review or camera. Her name became known, quietly at first and then widely, not because she ever sought it, but precisely because she never did. In a world where almost everyone chased the spotlight, a woman who turned away from it again and again became a kind of legend by refusal. She never gave the interviews. She never became the recruiting poster. She spent her years instead in the compound, teaching, passing down the lessons of a hard, kind old man from Montana, one candidate at a time. And the candidates she taught went out into the world and carried those lessons with them, and taught them to others. And in that way, Claire's grandfather's voice, that steady voice from a cold ridge, kept traveling forward through time long after both of them were gone, in the discipline of people who had never met either of them and never would. Cole made it through the program. He became, in time, one of the finest shooters of his generation, and he never once forgot the woman who taught him to let the truth show up on its own. Years later, when he had candidates of his own, he would sit down on the floor beside their bunks, the way Claire had sat beside his, and he would teach them to read a lying wind, and when they thanked him, he would say the thing Claire had said to him. "Don't thank me, just do it again. Be the person who can say they were wrong." And none of his candidates ever knew that the words came from a mocked 38-year-old captain who had gotten them from a Montana ranch, from an old man who never once told her she was good. Bannister retired 2 years after the review. On his last day, he came to find Claire, and the two of them stood together in the quiet, the man who had thrown her file across a table, and the woman who had never once made him pay for it. "I've been thinking about what to say to you," Bannister said, "for weeks, and I couldn't come up with anything big enough. Everything I thought of sounded too small." He shook his head. "So I'm just going to say the truest thing I know. You made me a better man, Captain. In the last chapter of a long career, when I thought I'd already learned everything I was going to learn, you taught me the biggest lesson of all, and you did it without ever once trying to. You just lived it in front of me until I couldn't help but see it." Claire looked at him, at the hard old man made softer, and she felt her throat tighten. "You taught me something too, Chief," she said. "You want to know what?" "What?" "You taught me that people can change," she said, "all the way, at any age, from anything. I'd half stopped believing it before you. I'd met so many people who dug in when they were proven wrong that I'd started to think that was just how people were. And then you threw my file across the table, and 3 weeks later you cleared land nav for me, and 2 months later you walked into a colonel's review and put your whole career on the line for me. You changed more completely than anyone I've ever known. And every time I doubt whether a person can really change, I think about you, and I remember that they can." Her voice was thick now. "That's a gift, Chief. You have no idea what a gift that is to a person who teaches for a living. You gave me back my faith that the work is worth doing." Bannister's eyes were wet, and he did not bother to hide it anymore. "Your grandfather," he said, "the legend I chased my whole career. I spent so long wishing I could have met him, and I've realized something. I did meet him. I met him in you. Everything I ever admired about that man, everything I held up as the standard, it was standing in front of me the whole time, in his granddaughter." He put out his hand. "It was the honor of my life, Captain. Every day of it, even the days I was too much of a fool to know it." Claire took his hand, and then, because a handshake was not enough for what had passed between them, she pulled the old man into an embrace, and the two of them stood there for a long moment. The mocker and the mocked, the doubter and the doubted, become something that neither of them had words for, and neither of them needed to name. Diaz graduated at the top of her class. On the day it happened, Claire stood at the back of the room and watched, and she thought about all of it. The whole long road, from a Montana ridge to a Florida compound, from a scared 14-year-old girl to this. She thought about her grandfather, who had never once told her she was good, and she understood at last why. It wasn't that he didn't believe in her, it was that he believed in her too much to let her stop. He knew that the moment she thought she'd arrived, she'd quit reaching, and so he kept the horizon always one step ahead of her, out of love, out of a fierce and patient love that looked like hardness and was really the deepest kindness of all. Now do it again. She'd spent her whole life doing it again, and now she watched Diaz walk across that room to receive what she'd earned, and she saw the girl's armor gone completely, replaced by something better, a stillness, a peace, a quiet strength that no doubt could ever touch. And Claire knew that the lesson had traveled, that her grandfather's voice would keep going forward now, through Diaz, through Cole, through every candidate she'd ever taught, long after Claire herself was gone. That was the only immortality she had ever wanted, not the cameras, not the posters, not the legend, just this. The lesson, traveling forward, from one patient person to the next forever. After the ceremony, Diaz came to find her one last time. "I don't know how to thank you, ma'am," the girl said, "for everything. You changed my whole life." Claire shook her head slowly. "I didn't change anything, Diaz," she said. "You did. I just stood beside you while you did it. That's all a teacher ever really does. We don't change anybody. We just refuse to leave while they change themselves." She smiled. "You want to thank me? Here's how. Someday there's going to be a candidate who walks into a room and everybody's going to look at them and decide they don't belong. And you're going to see it happen. And when you do, you're going to walk over to that candidate and you're going to say the thing I said to you. You're going to teach them to be still. That's how you thank me. You send it forward. You do it again." Diaz's eyes filled. "I will, ma'am," she said. "I promise I'll do it again." "I know you will," Claire said. "That's why I chose you. Not because you were the best shot, though you were, because you had the thing that matters more. You had a heart that could learn to set its armor down. And people like that are the ones who change the world, Diaz. Not the loud ones, not the fast ones. The patient ones who learn to be still and then spend their lives teaching others to be still too." She watched the girl walk away, out into a career that would carry her grandfather's lessons into places and lives Claire would never see. And she stood there for a long moment, alone at the end of a road that had started with laughter and a file thrown across a table. They had laughed at her once. Every one of them. They had looked at a 38-year-old woman and seen someone who didn't belong, someone trying to enter a world they were certain wasn't hers. They had bet she would quit by Friday. And she had answered them the only way that ever mattered. Not with anger, not with words, not with the need to prove them wrong. She had answered them by meeting the standard, one patient crack at a time, until there was nothing left for anyone to argue about. She had answered them the way her grandfather taught her on a cold Montana ridge a lifetime ago. She had answered them by being still while the world decided what she was, and then quietly, patiently, undeniably becoming more than any of them had the imagination to expect. The critics had made their predictions. The doubters had placed their bets. The whole room had laughed, but results always speak louder than laughter, and patience always outlasts doubt, and a lesson passed down with love never dies. Claire Whitmore did not answer them with words. She answered them with a life that proved them wrong, and then she spent that life teaching others to do the same. And that is the truest victory a person can ever win. Years later, on a quiet spring afternoon, an envelope arrived at the compound with Claire's name on it in handwriting she didn't recognize. She almost didn't open it. By then, she had learned to be careful with mail because the attention that had chased her for years still surfaced now and then in the form of writers wanting her story, producers wanting her face, strangers wanting a piece of the legend she had spent her whole life refusing to become. But something about this envelope was different. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had thought hard about every word before they wrote it. and there was no return address, only a single line in the corner. From the family you saved. Claire sat down slowly and she opened it and she read. It was from the child, not a child anymore. The letter explained that the boy Claire had saved that gray afternoon so many years ago was now a young man, grown, in college, studying to become a paramedic. His mother had kept the details from him for years, wanting to protect him from the weight of what had happened, and it was only recently, on his 18th birthday, that she had finally told him the whole truth, that there had been a shooter on a distant hill who had held a position for 4 hours in the cold, that when the worst moment came, when a weapon was raised toward him, a stranger he would never meet had made an impossible shot and given him the rest of his life. He wrote that he had spent months trying to find her, that the military had been protective of her name, which he understood and respected, that he had almost given up. And then, through a chain of people who knew people, a letter had finally found its way to the right compound. "I don't know how to write this," the young man had written. "There aren't words big enough. You gave me everything, every birthday I've had, every friend I've made, every ordinary day I never think twice about. All of it exists because you were patient enough to wait for the right moment and skilled enough to take it and brave enough to carry the weight of it afterward. I'm studying to save lives now. I want to spend mine doing for others what you did for me. I don't expect anything from you. I just needed you to know that the life you saved didn't go to waste. I've tried to make it worth a shot." Claire read the letter 3 times. And then she set it down on the table, and she put her face in her hands, and Captain Claire Whitmore, who had stood unbroken through mockery and doubt and a colonel's cold review, who had held steady through the hardest shot of her life without a tremor, finally let herself weep. Because in all the years since that afternoon, she had carried the weight of it exactly as her grandfather had carried his own, quietly alone, on the bad nights when the memory came back too vivid. She had held on to the one thing Bannister had told her that night in the dark. The child's alive. That's the whole reason. But she had never known what became of that life. She had never let herself find out, because finding out felt like it would make it too real, would turn a weight she had learned to carry into something she couldn't. And so for years, the child had remained, in her mind, only a small shape at a window, a life saved and then lost to time. And now here he was, grown, studying to save others, making the shot worth taking. She wrote him back that same evening. She thought about it for a long time, about what a person says to someone whose entire life exists in the space of a decision she made in half a second. And in the end, she wrote something simple, because the truest things are always simple. "You don't owe me anything," she wrote. "That's the first thing I need you to understand. I didn't give you your life. I only protected it. What you've done with it since, the studying, the wanting to save others, that's all yours, and it's beautiful. And I'm prouder of it than I have words for. But it's yours. Don't spend it trying to be worthy of a shot. Just spend it being who you are. That's already more than enough." And then she wrote the thing she most needed him to know. "You should know that you've given me a gift too. For years I carried that afternoon the way you carry any weight, in silence on the hard nights. And I never knew what became of the life I was carrying it for. Your letter told me, and now on the hard nights, I won't just have the weight. I'll have you, a young man studying to save lives. That's the thing that makes the weight bearable. So thank you. You found me to thank me, and it turns out you're the one who set something down that I've been carrying for a very long time." She signed it and she sent it, and something in her chest that had been clenched for years finally, quietly, let go. She told no one about the letter, not at first. It felt too large, too private, a thing between two people whose lives had been braided together by a single terrible afternoon. But that evening, sitting outside in the last of the light, she found herself thinking about her grandfather and about all the things he had carried and never spoken of, and she understood him more completely than she ever had. She had asked him once, when she was young, why he never talked about the times he'd had to do the real thing. And he had been quiet for a long while, and then he'd said, "Because the weight is mine to carry, Claire, not anybody else's. If I talk about it, I hand a piece of it to whoever's listening, and they didn't sign up to carry it. So I keep it. That's the price of the skill. You don't just carry the moment, you carry the silence around it too." She had been 14 and she hadn't understood. Now she was old enough to understand completely, and she understood something more, something her grandfather had perhaps never gotten to learn, because he had passed before anyone had come to find him and set his silence down. She understood that sometimes, if you are very lucky, the weight comes back to you transformed. That sometimes the life you carried in silence writes you a letter and studies to become a paramedic and gives you back a piece of the peace you gave away. She wished her grandfather had gotten a letter like that. She hoped, wherever he was, that he knew all the lives his lessons had saved through her, and through Cole, and through Diaz, and through everyone they had taught in turn. She hoped he knew that the silence he carried had not been carried in vain. The next morning she found Diaz, who was an instructor herself now, seasoned and calm, the armor long gone, replaced entirely by the stillness Claire had promised her she would find. "I want to tell you something," Claire said, "and I want you to remember it for when you have your own hard nights, because you will. We all do." Diaz sat down across from her. "What is it, ma'am?" Claire told her about the letter, about the child, grown now, studying to save lives, about the weight she had carried for years and the way the letter had transformed it. And she watched Diaz's eyes fill, because Diaz had done the real thing herself by then, once, in a situation not unlike Claire's, and she carried her own weight, her own silence. "I'm telling you this," Claire said, "because I need you to know that it doesn't have to stay heavy forever. The weight changes. Sometimes it takes years, and sometimes it takes a letter you never expected. But the lives you protect, they go on and become something. And someday, if you're lucky, you get to see it. And when you do, the weight doesn't disappear, but it turns into something you can carry. It turns into the reason you would do it all again." She reached out and took the younger woman's hand. "My grandfather never got that. He carried his silence to the ground alone. But you won't have to, and I won't have to, because we've told each other. That's the thing he never had, Diaz. Someone who understood. Don't carry it alone the way he did. Find the people who've held the same weight and set it down together, a little at a time." Diaz squeezed her hand, and neither of them said anything for a while, because some things pass between people without words. In the shared understanding of a burden only a few will ever know. The years went on as years do. Claire grew older, and the compound changed around her, and the candidates who arrived each season looked younger and younger until one day she realized that not a single person in the current class had been born when she made the shot that saved the child. She had become, without quite noticing it happen, the old lesson herself, the story instructors told to explain what patience was worth, the standard held up the way Bannister had once held up her grandfather. And she found, to her quiet amusement, that she didn't mind. A standard was only useful if it kept people reaching. If her story kept even one candidate reaching, then let them tell it. She never did give the interviews. She never became the poster. To the wider world, she remained a rumor, a name spoken with reverence by people who knew, a legend precisely because she had refused to be one. And she was at peace with that, more at peace than any famous person she had ever heard of seemed to be, because she had spent her life on the only things that had ever mattered to her. The work, the teaching, the passing down. On the day she finally retired, the whole compound turned out, and there were faces there she hadn't seen in years. Cole came, grizzled now himself, an instructor with a legend of his own, and he embraced her without a word, because everything that needed saying between them had been said long ago on the floor beside a bunk. Bannister came, very old now, walking with a cane, and he stood at attention in front of her one last time with a slow, trembling salute that undid her completely. And Hargrove came, the colonel who had once tried to prove she was a lie, retired himself now, who had spent the last chapter of his life being hard on the work and easy on the people, exactly as she had told him to. And at the very back of the crowd, unannounced, stood a young man she had never met in person, but would have known anywhere. He was a paramedic now, fully qualified, and he had driven a very long way to be there. And when their eyes met across the room, neither of them needed to say a word. He simply put his hand over his heart, and Claire put hers over hers. And across all those years and all that distance, the shot and the life it saved finally looked at each other and were at peace. She spoke briefly because she had never liked long speeches, and because the truest things are always simple. I was the woman nobody believed in it, she said. That's how this started a long time ago, in this very compound. They laughed at me. They bet I'd quit by Friday. And I want the young ones here to understand that I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me, or so you'll be impressed that I proved them wrong. I'm telling you because I need you to know that it doesn't matter who believes in you. It never did. The targets don't care about anyone's opinion, and neither, in the end, should you. She looked out over all of them, the young and the old, the ones just starting and the ones who had walked the whole road with her. What matters is the standard, whether you can meet it, whether you'll keep reaching for it long after everyone tells you to stop. My grandfather taught me that on a ranch in Montana when I was 14 years old, and I have spent my entire life trying to live up to it and pass it on. Anyone can pull a trigger. Only patient people understand when. Be patient. Be still. Be kind while the world decides what you are. And whatever you manage today, tomorrow, do it again. She stepped back, and the room rose to its feet, the same way the barracks had risen for her all those years ago, in a silence deeper than applause. That evening, alone, she sat outside one last time as an instructor, with her grandfather's rifle across her knees, the one she had carried her whole career. And she thought about the long road and the people on it, and the lesson that would keep traveling forward now without her. They had laughed at her once, and she had answered them, not with words, not with anger, not with the need to be proven right, but with a life of patience and discipline and quiet, stubborn kindness. A life that had saved a child and changed a hard old man and undone a cold colonel and lifted the armor from a frightened young woman and sent a lesson forward through time into lives she would never see. The critics had made their predictions. The doubters had placed their bets. The whole world had laughed, but a patient person, still and kind and unbroken, always outlasts the laughter. A lesson passed down with love never dies. And a life spent reaching for a standard others said you'd never meet is the only answer that ever truly silences the room. Claire Whitmore had been told she wouldn't last a week. She lasted a lifetime, and she made that lifetime matter. And she handed it forward to everyone who came after. And that is a victory no doubter can ever take back, and no history can ever forget.